Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by our lecturer in philosophy, Dr. Benjamin Smith. And today our topic is going to be Hegel and freedom. We're gonna trace back to one of our previous episodes on Hegel and talk about where we talked about the importance of his thought, but also this week we really want to get into his idea of freedom. But before we do so, I want to invite all our listeners, please hit that subscribe button, share this content, share this info, send it out to your friends and family. It helps us a lot. And we've noticed lately a few of our episodes have been toggled down a little bit because of the topics that we've covered. And in our opinion, they're not all that controversial, but apparently they are for the algorithms. So help us out a lot. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and please share this content. And as always, check out all of our full courses over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com, where you can purchase the courses outright, or you can become a subscription member, and you'll have access every month. You'll have access to the courses, and you can take all sorts of courses in philosophy and theology from a faithful Catholic perspective. All right, Dr. Smith, let's get into this idea of Hegel and freedom. And if you go back into a lot of our podcasts, we've covered freedom from all different sorts of angles.
That's right.
It seems to be a fun topic of ours that we enjoy talking about. And I know this episode will be no different. So, but to build on what we've already covered, maybe take us back, because we talked about in a previous episode, we talked about the importance of Hegel's thought, that many people may not know him like they do Kant or something like that, but Hegel has had just an enormous impression on our modern culture, society, and modern our operating philosophy right now in society. So maybe give us a quick review, and then we'll hop into the topic of freedom.
Yes. So in that previous episode, which we'll link to, we talked about sort of his importance in sort of history, but which really kind of primarily revolves around the fact that he's probably the first modern philosopher to seriously develop a theory of, or a philosophy of, history, right? That is, he is interested in the nature of history and understanding history, and especially the way that history impacts reason and the way we think. In our modern setting, that's the way it seems very obvious. Well, of course, history impacts the way that you think, but really, the truth is, if you look at really most philosophers have had they wouldn't necessarily have disagreed with that statement if you'd brought it to them, I think, but in truth, they just didn't bring it up, like that much. Like the idea that reason changes over time, right, is a Hegelian thesis, right? So he thinks, look, it's good that, like somebody like Aristotle looks at experience, or David Hume, or any sort of empiricist looks at experience. But one of the things that he would say that philosophers have left out is they've left out the experience of history, right? That is, like the experience changes over time, right?
Right.
And what he says is that if when we look at history, is that we find that Geist itself, that is our awareness of ourselves and the world around us, changes radically with the historical paradigm in which we operate.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, I want to add this, so the idea that consciousness changes over times, right? Over time, or time frames, that's something that a lot of modern people would accept. But it's important to note, like, Hegel didn't take that in a radically skeptical direction. Very often in contemporary discussions, that goes in a skeptical direction or a postmodern direction, but Hegel doesn't. He thinks that each historical epoch is, in fact, achieves a certain sort of real insight and is, in fact, necessary, right? So he sees it sort of as a building process, right? So each step is necessary but inadequate, right? So there is a real gain made when you pivot from Greek civilization or from Persian civilization to Greek civilization, and then from Greek civilization to Roman civilization.
Yeah.
The Greek civilization achieves something, right? So he sees like in that sense, he's positive, right? He thinks the Greeks achieved something, but he also thinks that their achievement was not needed to be superseded, right? So you kind of think it, maybe a parallel would be something like technological development.
Sure.
We might say like, steam power was a necessary stage in industrialization, right? But eventually it needed to be superseded, albeit we still use some steam power, but it needed to be superseded by forms of power that are more efficient, right?
Yeah. And this is just kind of the basic idea, and you could see kind of the building blocks here for kind of the progressive movement, that
Sure.
all of history is on this progressive. And so they'll say, and communists pick this up as well. We've discussed this before, where, capitalism is a necessary stage
That's
towards,
true. Yeah.
It's previous to socialism, and then next comes this beautiful communism. So you could see this, or the idea we want you to have in your mind is kind of this trajectory of going up, where Geist is progressing, and in one day there will be this fulfillment of history, this perfection of history.
Yeah, and that fulfillment will ultimately, Hegel thinks, consist in the mind fully understanding and appropriating to itself its own freedom, right?
Yeah.
So Geist, right, means something like spirit, but more like spirit of the age than like a soul kind of spirit, right?
Yeah.
And or it can also be translated mind, but it has sort of those two things together. I like spirit's probably maybe a little bit better because it does kind of connect to, it has more of a connotation of movement and being in time. But he thinks of mind, right? That mind is what makes us free, right? Yeah. The spirit is what makes us free, and that the whole of history, right? And if you were getting into the metaphysics, which we're not, but the whole of reality really is the mind coming to fully understand and grasp and then actualize its own freedom, right?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what that means.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. So, like I said, we've circled around this question of freedom quite a bit in our different podcasts. It's an important topic, and there's subtle differences, between different versions of freedom. Hegel, like any German thinker of his time, would be heavily indebted to and influenced by, even if negatively influenced by, of course, Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
To Kant's this great figure of German philosophy, who just sort of hangs over the whole project for a very, very, very long time. Hegel, sort of in a way, basically accepts the core Kantian idea of freedom, but then changes it. He calls that Kantian idea of freedom morality, right? And morality, in his view, it's a real achievement, just like, again, this view, right? But at the same time, it's inadequate, right? We should move up to the moral, but then we have to go beyond the moral to what he calls the ethical, right?
Right.
And I'll explain that as we go along. But we do need to first achieve the moral. So what's the moral? So this is basically a Kantian idea of freedom. So this is really interesting. If I were to ask you, Jason, is doing what you feel like doing, or what you want to do, like say you want a glass of beer, you go pour yourself a glass of beer and drink a glass of beer. Is that freedom?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah. So Kant might agree
according to Kant. No.
Kant. Right. Yeah. So, So just acting on your desires, and this is kind of interesting. I mean, there's something I think, like with a lot of philosophical ideas, there's something correct about this and something incorrect, right? Acting on your desires, or letting desires be your sole or primary influence on your decision making, is not freedom.
Yeah.
in Kant's view. Freedom consists in we said several different things about this, but freedom consists in rational decision making, basically,
Yeah.
or what he calls duty, right?
Right.
So doing your duty, oddly enough, you're sounding us, but is freedom. That is, doing what is rational is doing your duty. Now, why is so? If you're just acting on your desires, right? Say you're attracted to a particular woman, and on that basis you decide to date her and then marry her. That's not being free. Why is that? Because your desires are not chosen, right?
Yeah.
Which is so fascinating to me, right? The idea is that anything that's not chosen by you is not really free, including your desires, even your physiological desires, but then also your sort of cultural, social, inherited desires, all those things, they're not really free. And so to act on them is not to really be free. Mm-hmm.
So you're saying if I get that glass of beer, it's not really my fault.
Well,
all right, I'm starting to like Kant a little more. I like this. Yeah. So that the idea that because you don't choose your desires, they're kind of impulses.
Right.
That's an outside force acting on you, encouraging you one way and not another. Therefore, if you choose what you desire, you are not free because of this outside force that's acting on your intellect and your will.
Yeah. Pretty much. You need to choose.
How do you choose? Like, how do you choose?
How does
that work? How does that work? How do you say, like, I choose this desire, but
yeah, so you act according to the categorical imperative, right? So the categorical imperative tells you to only choose that which you could choose universally, right?
Yeah.
Another way of putting it is you only choose that which anyone would choose.
Yeah.
And choose consistently for all, right? So that allows that in Kant's mind is rational because it's universal and consistent.
Yeah.
Right. So I would only choose, I can't choose theft or murder or lying because I can't choose that for all. I wouldn't choose it for all, and I can't choose it for all. Right. Choose murder for all would include my own destruction and the destruction of everyone. Right. So those are things that are not rational to choose. Right. In that sense of rational. And so I should choose then the opposite, to respect private property, to respect innocent life, to not lie, but rather be honest, right? Those sorts of things, right? That's being free, right? So like say choosing a marriage partner, I shouldn't choose someone. I mean, it's some again, this is not totally wrong. It's just kind of off, right?
Yeah.
I shouldn't choose a marriage partner just on the basis of attraction. Now, I think Kant would take it a little bit further. I shouldn't choose a marriage partner on the basis of attraction, right? Which is a little bit stronger, right? Going from just to attraction, right? Why? Well, because, right, if you do so, right, you're not really free because your attractions are not really free, right? You should choose a marriage partner that you would choose for anyone, right? That, for universally, right? And so, you come up with maybe a list of categories that don't relate to desire, but relate to marriage, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, it's not
totally wrong, but I wouldn't put it that way.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think what you want to say, the difference, say from an Aristotelian perspective or Thomist approach, is to say, yes, you shouldn't choose only on the basis of desire or attraction, right? But that attraction and desire is part of your decision making, right? And it shouldn't be ignored. And doing what you want to do, as long as it's in keeping with reason, is actually free, right? Again, as long as it's in keeping with reason.
Yeah.
But I think there's a deep difference here in the sense of what you mean by reason, right? Kant narrows reason down to just consistent and universal, right?
Yeah.
That's part of reasoning, right? But for a Thomist, right, reason includes that it's ordered towards the truth of being, right, of reality, right, and that sort of fills and it gives a lot more sort of room and substance, right, than just
reality,
like reality, right, right, rather than simply limiting it to being universal and consistent. So like with a lot of philosophical ideas, there's some truth to this, right? But it's importantly off. So that's what Hegel considers the moral, right?
The moral, right?
Which he thinks is good, is decent description of freedom, but it needs to be superseded, and it needs to become the ethical, right? Now, what the ethical brings in, and this is true of Hegel's sort of turn of mind in general, is it needs to bring in the social and the historical, right? Now, why is that the case? He thinks that mutual recognition of freedom between free agents is a necessary step in our own understanding of our own freedom, right? So think about it this way, right? Like, how do you know you're really free, right? You know you're really free when something else that's free recognizes you as free, right? So you might be kind of going around with this idea, well, I'm kind of free. This sounds maybe a little strange, but think about like in your own life where, like it might sound a little strange in modern life where we have so much freedom, in a sense, I guess. We all think we're free and insist on our freedom in different ways. But if you think about other historical periods, right, where you may be a serf or you may be a slave, right? The freedom of your own mind may not be apparent. Or think about a different way of this. Let's say that you're a farmer and you're 10 years into, like, you're a farmer in the 18th century and you're behind that plow, right? And the plow is being pulled and you're out there doing something you kind of don't want to do, right? Like, this feels like crap. It's hot. I'm tired, right? I don't want to keep doing this, but I have to do it, right? That's a different, then you think about your own life. We all experience that, right? Where we're doing things we don't want to do, right? And we're experiencing things we don't want to experience,
right? But you have to,
Either you have to because of some other goal or because of some external factors.
Sure.
Right. Like you might lose your job. Right. And you went, wait, I didn't want to lose my job. Right. And then doesn't matter. So, we all experience that kind of limitation on our freedom. And that might bring into your mind, well, am I really free? So, does that make sense, Jason?
Yeah. And like you said, we've all had that experience where we can do otherwise. Like, it's possible for me just to not go to work.
Sure.
But I have this outside, I have to do it, If you've ever had a cubicle job or something like that, you've probably had one of those days. If you've ever watched Office Space, right? Like that's kind of the basis of Office Space, So that kind of experience, I think we all understand. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, well, am I free? What does that freedom consist of? What are the elements to understanding freedom in the right way? Because I can do otherwise. So am I really free in doing this? So a lot of questions pop up.
We bump into constraints all the time, and things that contradict our will, right? That contradict what we intend or desire or choose, right? If we could do otherwise. So, Hegel thinks that, and this is especially true historically, but also true in the way that I was just talking about, in terms of constraint, that really being free requires, or is only verified. We only come to a full consciousness of our own freedom when other free agents recognize us as free, right? So, I react to other human beings in a way that's different right, to inanimate objects, right?
Yes.
I don't expect inanimate objects to talk back to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or to think about me. I don't expect them to think at all, right? Like my coffee cup, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
It's inanimate. It's not free. It totally follows the laws of physics. The laws of physics pretty much determine everything about it. Maybe chemistry and so forth as well. But that's not true necessarily with other human beings, right? With other human beings, I come to recognize, oh, they're aware of themselves. They're free, right? And how do I know they're free? Because they do things I don't want them to do. Right. Okay. Right.
Children.
Right. You recognize, wow, they're autonomous. One, they're different from me. They're making different choices than I would make, and they're not following my will. Right.
Mm-hmm.
They're not controlled by me. They have a certain kind of freedom. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I recognize that in them. Right. Now, in recognizing their freedom, I'm in a sense verifying that freedom. I'm giving them an external objective, not subjective, right? Not just inside my own mind, but an external objective verification. Yes, you are free, right?
Okay.
An objective realization of so to put it in Hegelian terms, an objective realization of the freedom of the other, right?
Freedom of the other. Okay.
Right. And then of course I want that for myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I need that for myself in order to be fully aware of my own freedom, to pass from subjective awareness of my freedom to objective awareness of my freedom.
And is this the movement then from morality to ethic, from the moral to the ethic?
That's right. Yeah. The ethical, we're almost there. The ethical is going to be when we mutually recognize each other's freedom.
Okay.
Right. And act accordingly.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay.
That's the ethical, right? Which brings in the political realm. But I think this point about mutual recognition is really interesting, right? That is, in order to achieve freedom, it's necessary for there to be to fully achieve freedom. It's necessary for there to be this mutual recognition of freedom by the other. That means that my freedom, in a sense, depends on you, right? And depends on those around me. Which is interesting from several points of view, but I think Hegel's got a little bit of a point here that we need to recognize, which is this. Let's say you thought, Jason, that you were a talented musician, right? You've been working on playing your, strumming your guitar. Did you ever have a time, Jason, where you tried to learn to play the guitar?
No, I was a drummer.
Drummer. Okay, that's good. All right, so you're so you think, okay, I'm a drummer. I'm going to be a rock star, right? I'm going to, be a drummer for Guns N' Roses, Metallica. Damn, I'm showing my age, right?
I'll take all that.
Anyways, but then as you're thinking to yourself, man, I'm really great. This is awesome. I'm so good at this, right?
And then you see a real drummer.
Well, then you bring somebody in beside yourself, right? And what you want is to hear that other person say, hey, Jason, you're a good drummer.
Yeah.
I just had this experience. I have this experience with one of my children from time to time. He'll ask me, oh, did I do that well?
Yeah.
Do you think I did a good job at that? Right. So like my youngest son, this is first year playing football. So he's always asking for this external verification of how he did. Isn't that interesting? Right. And we all want that, I think, at some points. They think about
sure.
Like when you present an academic paper or something like you want some external recognition, right? And if you don't get that external recognition, it's kind of disturbing and unpleasant, right?
Well, and it becomes you do in some sense become unsure of your own ability to judge the reality of the situation. Like, well, I thought that was a good paper, but I got torches and pitchforks. So
right. And so it does give you some sense of, oh, well, that was just merely my subjective judgment about it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas once you're recognized as free by another free agent, then you're like, oh, my knowledge of myself as free is now objective, not simply subjective, right?
Yeah, and you could see that, if especially if it's somebody with some sort of expertise, right? So if you give a paper and there's like, a 30-year professor,
sure.
And he says that was a good paper,
Sure.
like that means something more than, my wife, saying, I don't know what you talked about, but that sounded like a good paper. Like
Sure.
As much as, like it's not this recognition doesn't seem to just be the subjective recognition from another person, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And so, like you said, it brings in kind of this objectivity to it.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think absolutely. So I think Hegel's got a point about this. Another sort of angle on this, another way of thinking about it would be like, like say you're having a really good, like a deep conversation with somebody and it's kind of a personal conversation, and they bring up an insight about you that you have never really thought about before, right? Yeah. You're like, oh, like actually, like you can actually, like from time to time, you have one of those conversations and you really learn something about yourself from someone else, right?
Yeah.
Which seems sort of strange. How would they know? Like, how would they know me better than me, right? Well, sometimes that happens. Maybe we have a blind spot. Maybe, there's something we haven't recognized. So I think from a variety of angles, you can see, I think, the importance of what Hegel's getting at here in terms of mutual recognition. That is that we're only going to have an objective awareness of our freedom when it's recognized by others.
Okay.
Now that, though, presents a problem.
Yeah, what's the problem here?
Well, the problem is you could call it the problem of the other, right? And we begin, so I have to back up a bit. We begin to become aware of ourselves as free. First, by just becoming aware of ourselves. And the first and most basic way in which we become aware of ourselves is aware of ourselves as agents of desire, right?
Okay.
I want such and such, right? I want to have it, I want to control it, and I want to consume it, right? So I want that glass of beer. I'm going to pour that glass. I'm going to take, right, like the bottle of beer out of the fridge, pour it into the glass, and I'm going to consume it, and I'm not going to share it, and it's mine. Got it? Yep. So we all have the desire to possess, right? And we become very aware of this, especially when we don't get what we want. We come to recognize, oh, I'm over here, and the thing that I want is over there, right? And it is different than I, because I can't get what I want.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not in control of that thing. Right. I think it's an interesting way to think about it. And I mean, again, there's some truth to this, right? That is that we do have that experience, right, of wanting to possess something, right? Maybe wanting to control something and not being able to do so, right?
Yeah.
And in that moment, recognize the distinction between the external, the object, and the subject, that sort of thing, right? That I am over here and what I want to possess is over there, and they are two different things, right?
Yeah.
That helps me to recognize myself as an agent. And myself is free, and as others is free. But the problem is, if I start to think, well, Jason is one like I am, which is free, but also desirous, right? He wants to control and possess, right? Well, that's a threat to me, because he might want to control and possess what I want to control and possess.
Yeah.
Right. Now, Hegel's not a Marxist, okay? But you can kind of think like Marx is somebody inspired by Hegel. He takes it in a different direction, but you can feel a little bit of that, I think, in what we're talking about here in the problem of the other, right?
Yeah.
Your freedom is actually a threat to my freedom, right? And I think this is it's kind of interesting, right? Way of putting it. What do you think about that?
Well, I think this is the case when you're talking about or when you're entering into the elements of like somebody developing a philosophy of history. It doesn't just hit on metaphysics, or it doesn't just hit on epistemology. It hits on everything.
That's right.
So when you're saying this, you're like, okay, Phil, just kind of thinking about it, that sounds correct. It's like, okay, now apply this economically. Boom.
Sure.
You can see where Marxism comes from.
Right.
Apply this to here. So yeah, so I mean, the idea of the other and how it fits into not just your freedom, but like you said, the moral. What are you to do in this situation with the other?
Yeah. So one thing that has been done, right, is mastery and slavery, according to Hegel, right? And it's really interesting. I mean, a big part of his work is called the master-slave dialectic, in which he talks about the idea of, we could be talking about literal slavery and mastery, right? But we could also any sort of hierarchical power structure, right? And that hierarchical power has been a way of dealing with this, whether between people or between classes or between religions or between nations, right? Again, this explodes into a whole thing that we have today, right? But in a sense, though, it's undeniably true that this is part of history, right? Mastery and slavery, hierarchical power, right, is part of history. Some people dominating others. Why? Because to Hegel's mind, those others represent a threat to the master's freedom. Right. And so the way for the masters to ensure their freedom is to dominate the other. Right.
You can see like the most extreme example that we have today is the fight over parents' rights with their children.
Sure.
Right. Do parents have the rights to, not allow their child to have, growth hormones or hormone therapy? Some would say no. Like the parent is restricting the freedom of the child.
Freedom.
Right. So
that's a form of
you can
domination.
See it's just and you can also see why communists have a problem with the nuclear family.
Sure.
Because it is hierarchical in that way. So okay, so there's this problem of the other. So how does Hegel, how are we supposed to act in this situation with Hegel?
So it's taken about 2,000 years or so, Jason. But we needed to move Geist. And again, there's a larger metaphysical picture that we haven't really touched on, but Geist, that is the human mind, has had to move through various stages, through various historical epochs, in order to begin to work this problem out, right? So let's say that you have a difficult. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say you have a really difficult marriage, and you go to marriage counseling, right? And over time, maybe it takes a couple of years, right? You have to work through a particular problem.
Sure.
And then over time, sort of come out on the other side with that problem having been sort of healed or at least corrected in some measure, that kind of thing, right? Well, so it took time, right? It took discussion, it took argument, it took reconceptualization, creativity. Maybe it took putting away old habits and adopting new habits, right? That sort of thing, right? Well, that's on a small scale what's had to happen in human history, right? This problem of the other is the source of all social change. It's the source of international conflict. It's the source of culture and society. Interestingly, though, Hegel doesn't see that all as negative, right? Because he thinks each stage of history is a better realization, right, of our own freedom, right? So there is this sort of progress to it, as you said earlier. I put it this way. I would describe this to students in introduction to philosophy class, that it's history may zigzag, or like this, right?
Mhm.
So you might go up in freedom, then down in freedom, but the trajectory is always this way.
Yeah.
Right. So even if there are setbacks, those setbacks are offset by greater gains.
Right.
Right. So it's kind of like that old saying, like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe you do have that 1 step back, but you're still making progress over time. Right.
Yeah.
If you so anyways, that he sees that this has worked out in history. And how it's worked out in history is the development of the modern rational state is the solution to the problem of the other, right? And it's what allows us to move from the merely moral, which is good, it's just inadequate, to the fully ethical, right? Which includes, right, this mutual recognition of freedom, right? And the state's important because if you think about the mutual recognition of freedom as necessary for the full objective realization of freedom, then you also have the problem of the other, right? So you've got a paradox, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So even my own objective freedom is only going to be realized in a situation where we overcome the problem of the other. And what that means is that my objective freedom is a social achievement. It's a cultural achievement. It's not something I can achieve on my own. It's something I can only achieve in dialogue, dialectic relationship with others, right?
Yeah.
So freedom is not something we achieve individually. Objective freedom is something that we achieve together, right? It's a social achievement, right? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, part of me says, yeah, I could see that, sure. Right? Like we as a society should not have systems of slavery, right? That's a societal thing that we can set up, and that's an achievement, right? We don't, currently in the United States, we don't have the form of slavery we had in the 1830s, 1850s, that's an achievement, right? So that sounds good.
But yeah, I think Hegel conceives of that as more positive. I mean, yes, that okay, but more positively, right? Right, like your ability to go on vacation and drive your kids in a camper to a state park. You're like, hey, we want to go camping in a state park this weekend, right? Well, you could not have brought that about on your own, right? There had to be roads, there had to be state parks, there had to be park rangers. There's all of these things that make it possible for you to choose that, right? This is the way Hegel conceptualizes it, right? So again, I want to say there's something that he's right about here. And there is a sense in which, I mean, this is interesting because he's a modern philosopher, like he's kind of in the very end stage of what we consider modern philosophy, right? But he's pushing against a lot of earlier modern philosophy, right? Which was much more individualistic, think about people like Kant, Locke, Hegel, Rene Descartes, all those guys, much more individualistic in the way that they thought about things, right? Hegel sort of pivoting to a more social view, right?
Yeah.
Which is one that, from the 19th century going forward to our own time, with some exceptions, though, is something that's, part of our discussion, right? It's a major shift, right, from the earlier modern folks who tended to be much more individualistic, like those Enlightenment philosophers and so forth, much more individualistic than Hegel. And if you think about older philosophy, like Aristotle, right? I mean, he defines one of the definitions of a human being is that a human being is a political animal, right? That is, that we only thrive and flourish within a decently ordered political community.
Yeah, a problem though I could quickly see arising is this what does Hegel mean by, like, the kind of because the rule here, the standard is the rational.
That's right.
Like, how is that defined? I mean, because like right now, even in our society, I mean, there seems, I mean, to some people, we're being extremely rational and accommodating of people's autonomy. And on the other hand, right, I think most Catholics would just say, well, it's hard to have a conversation these days because the rational has simply left the building.
Yeah.
Right. So who defines this rational state of mind, or the rational Geist that's supposed to be our guide?
The state. That's the answer, right?
Okay.
And Hegel has kind of in mind the kind of some version of Prussia, right? Which eventually became the German Empire, early under Bismarck. Hegel did, receive. I think I mentioned this last podcast. Hegel received like a medal, right?
Oh yeah.
From the last king of Prussia, who was also the first German emperor. So, let me put this. How do we overcome the problem of the other? We overcome the problem of the other by I recognize the other fully, and the other recognizes me fully as free and rational, right? Mm-hmm. To ensure that happens, though, and to ensure that activity consistent with mutual recognition of freedom happens, right? We need something beyond individuals. Right. We need the state, which requires a government to unify the state. Right.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, I recognize you, you recognize me, but we're still on this even playing field. There it seems that there needs to be something that both of us have to recognize that's outside of both of our selves.
That's right. Yep. And that's the state. Yeah. And the state, what the state does for us is that it ensures that that we're going to live, it makes a freedom objective, right?
Yeah.
Until, in his view, right, this is the way he describes it, freedom becomes objective when the state imposes a system of mutual recognition and processes and activities that are in keeping with that mutual recognition, right? So you might decide one day, you're like, you know what, that Dr. Smith, he's a jerk. He can't control himself. Actually, he's kind of worthless. He's not really free, right? Yeah. And can't govern himself, and et cetera. Right? Well, and so you decide to do something, inappropriate, right? Like kick me off Catholic Studies Academy or something like that. Mm-hmm. But anyways, get rid of that guy. Well, the state's going to come in there and make sure that you don't.
Yeah.
Right. The state is what's going to ensure mutual recognition and activities and processes in keeping with mutual recognition. Right. And the way it does that is by imposing rules that are universalizable.
Yeah.
And consistent.
Yeah.
Right. You see that, right? And interestingly, Hegel's clear on this. It can't really be a democracy. Right.
Yeah.
Because if it was a democracy, there would be factions. So it'd be inconsistency, not like one side would try to get over the other side, right?
Yeah, sure.
And impose its rules that are particular and and then very often based on desires and all that. It has to be a state, basically of civil servants under a monarch or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Who develop rules that are universalizable and consistent and ensure mutual recognition. And as I say, activities in keeping with mutual recognition. Then, so in that conception, objective freedom, the highest realization of objective freedom is obedience to the rational state. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, the Texan in me is very angry right now.
See, so this is really interesting. He would say, although in truth, right, you're if I remember correctly, you're German in background, right?
Yeah.
what you're feeling there, Jason, he would call immature Anglo-Saxon freedom. He actually uses that phrase, right?
Is that is that the beginning of white privilege?
No, he thinks German. No, not exactly. He thinks German freedom is mature freedom, right? So it's immature Englishmen, right? Who have immature English freedom. So you think that doing what you want is freedom?
Yeah,
you're wrong.
Right. I'm wrong. Yeah,
right, because you didn't choose your desires.
Yeah,
right? And so that's why we need the state to come in and take people like you, right, and kind of straighten them out, right?
Yeah,
or at least put them in a system that will keep them from doing what they want to do. So I thought, go ahead.
I was going to say, is there any place in Hegel's system for religion outside of just kind of moral inspiration?
Yeah, actually, he really thinks that his view is completely in keeping with Christianity, and he's very specific Christianity, right?
Interesting.
In particular, Protestant Lutheran Christianity. He sees Christianity as a necessary stage in the development of the consciousness of human freedom, particularly in sort of the idea of sort of the universal dignity of all human beings, especially with the incarnation of Jesus Christ, right? Showing, God's love for mankind, all that kind of thing. So he thinks that I'm not sure that we would, certainly in his youth, he was pretty heterodox as a Lutheran. Yeah. Most of the things I've read about him is that by the time he hit middle age and later, he was, I would say, a fairly Orthodox Lutheran. Not maybe strictly Orthodox, but fairly. He certainly was a regular churchgoer at that time and supported the Lutheran Church and supported publicly supported the Lutheran Church.
Oh wow! Who decides on this rational state? I mean, there's somebody has to be in charge.
Sure.
Somebody, is that the philosopher king? Is that? I mean, like, how does that end of it work?
So this famous statement, right? And Hegel made it says the state is God marching through history, right?
Yeah.
And in his view, right, as he says, the rational is the actual, and the actual is the rational. Geist has its own trajectory.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of like this weird providentialist kind of view, right? Geist has its own trajectory, and Geist has created the Prussian state, right?
Yeah.
Over time, and that Prussian state, right, is the Prussian state was one of the first states to have a professional civil service, right? Civil, they actually would have uniforms in those days. Like they were tied. They had like little uniforms, right? So Star they were like Trek, servants of the state, and they very dutifully went to their clerk's office and clerked away, right? You had sort of something like a constitutional monarchy that was with a monarch that was a Lutheran and well educated and German. And you had civil servants who were well educated and Lutheran and German. And the civil service and the bureaucracy that it was, they're experts, Jason. That's the way to think. They're experts, right?
Yeah.
And as civil servants, they love the community. So there is a kind of a Platonic philosopher king edge to this, I think, to some degree.
Or it can go the other way, where it's kind of like an elitist rule, where
Hegel just doesn't think that's the way it's going, right? Like that's not in keeping with the trajectory of history. Yes, we may sadly fall back into something like that in time, but overall we're moving in the right direction, right?
Right.
So yeah.
All right. So
So it's a hopeful philosophy, right? One thing that's interesting is he's not cynical, right?
Yeah.
Now, one thing that's just one last thing to add in here. I know we're getting close to the end, but is he is, for example, he's very critical of the French Revolution
Sure.
because he saw the French Revolution as too radical, right?
Mhm.
That is, each stage of history has within it certain achievements, right?
Mhm.
Hegel thinks, and those achievements shouldn't be lightly thrown away or torn down overnight, right?
Mhm.
They might need to be superseded, but they should be
Yeah.
superseded in a rational way, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
you go
I
ahead.
remember seeing, or remember reading, different, even during the rise of communism.
Mm,
There was those that wanted revolution, and
mm,
there were those that were more saying, well, it'll eventually get there, because they had this Hegelian view of history, and so they were a
sure.
little more
Yeah.
passive and not so much, you know, we need to overthrow this now in order to
Mm,
speed up Geist or something like that.
right.
It's like,
Yes. Yeah. To speed up the march of history. No. Yeah.
yeah.
So, like, if you think about the French Revolution, we get our terms right and left from the assembly, where all of the people in the assembly wanted some change,
Yeah.
right? Those on the right wanted a moderate kind of change. They wanted moderate reform. They didn't necessarily want to get rid of the monarchy, for example. That's what
Mhm.
they wanted to maybe constitutionalize it, limit, that kind of thing. But they didn't necessarily want to get rid of the monarchy. They weren't necessarily anti-religious. Some of them were, but some of them weren't. They were on the right. They were the
Yeah.
moderates, right? The guys on the left were the Jacobins, right? They were like, let's cut anybody's head off. Let's change the calendar. Let's worship the goddess reason. Let's destroy the Catholic
Yeah.
Church. Let's get rid of the Catholic Mass, right? That's a whole, right? Hegel would have rejected those guys, right? He would have thought
Yeah.
the guys who were on the right were the correct, like, okay, we're going to reform this, right? We're not going to destroy, right, the whole thing there, right? We're going to make it more rational, more,
Mhm.
increase the freedom involved in it, but we're not going to sort of level everything, right? And so he does think that you need to, part of the rational state is not being crazy rational,
Yeah.
like the person who wants to like overthrow everything. So there's a philosopher I don't particularly like named Peter Singer, but he's a pretty good scholar of Hegel.
Yeah.
And he says it's kind of like he has a good sort of metaphor. He says it's kind of like if you have a urban planner who becomes a total dictator and destroys, like, he's like, all of these streets are irrational, all of these houses are irrational, right? It just levels everything and puts everybody in skyscrapers because it's a more efficient use of space.
Yeah.
All the streets are at right angle, right? But there's certain goods, right, that are lost in that hyper rationalization
Sure.
of urban planning, right? And that's kind of like a good metaphor for the French Revolution. They threw too much away, right?
Okay.
There were goods that were lost, right, by that. And so a rational state, right, is going to be one that is sympathetic
Mhm.
to custom,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of the conservative side of Hegel, right? So he does kind of want the Prussian monarchy, and if he would have wanted the German Empire to kind of move in a constitutional direction, right? But he wouldn't want to get rid of the monarch, wouldn't want to get rid of the church, those sorts of things, right? In fact, he thinks that they're probably important elements to the German state, right?
Yeah.
So, I thought, yeah, so it's an interesting view of freedom. It's a view of freedom, interesting enough, in which the highest objective realization of freedom is an obedience to the rational state.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
And
know?
you could see, yeah. I mean, I hope our listeners can see, some parallels, right? Well, it's
Sure.
not, exactly what we have now, but you could see, I think, again, based on our previous discussion as well, the influence of Hegel, not just his understanding of history, but also this understanding of freedom kind of within the historical development of progress of
it's
moving
fascinating
towards it.
It's fascinating to me. Of course, this is in the background of what becomes the Marxist view, right?
Sure.
Hegel's not a Marxist. Like I think Hegel would have thought Marx needs to be put in jail. Okay.
Yeah.
But I have all. I mean, there's one of the things I've been interested in political philosophy over the years, and we just wrap up with this: is how is it that left philosophies and social movements conceptualize themselves as a form of freedom, right?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of confusing to me. Like you're coercive, and you're like this huge state mechanism. Yeah. So how is that free? And I think there is a way of accounting for it. I don't necessarily agree with it, of course, but Marx conceptualized what he was doing as promoting human freedom, right?
Yeah.
That in liberation from hierarchical power of class exploitation and capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Man actually becomes free, right? That does take the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? But that is the necessary stage. So again, if you can hear Hegel in the background, right?
Yep.
Moving towards the realm of absolute freedom. Again, Hegel is not a Marxist. I tend to put Hegel kind of more on the right,
sure, in
political terms, because he's a little more like he's pro-religion, pro-family, that kind of thing. He's for private property, etc. So he's more on the right, but he does conceptualize freedom, right? Isn't doing what you want to do, right? And again, it's partially correct.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. We don't think freedom is license.
No,
right?
Yeah. But at the same time, I'm not sure that we think of freedom as obedience to the state either.
No.
Right? So I mean, not necessarily, anyways, right? But anyway, so interesting. I think probably the best way to think about his view on politics is what you said, Jason, or suggested. It's kind of like a modern version of the philosopher king.
Sure.
Like if you can think, okay, the state really is this rational, custom guided, universalizing, mutual recognition, ensuring, sort of form of organization that does secure all these goods for us, then maybe you can think that, see how that would all work.
You just have to ignore like fallen human nature, God,
history,
the good,
facts.
All right, Dr. Smith, good discussion. I hope our listeners have taken something away from this to understand the modern culture we live in, but also to try to understand where the other is coming from. Sure. in this perspective. It's always a good tactic for the Christian apologist out there to understand the side of the other, to understand, especially we see Hegel and his influence on history becoming more and more prevalent in our modern state. So I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I want to invite all our listeners, please go check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.